Hi, this is lecture number 3 for Communications 102. It's on media as information, and we're going to focus on journalism and see how advertising and PR have an effect on that, but we're going to focus mostly on journalism. I worked for the Daily Southtown when it was a real paper back in the 90s, so that's one of the reasons we're going from this perspective. You have to remember one of the things we're talking about in this class is the constraints that are put on the marketplace of ideas, and some of those are called extra legal constraints. In this sense, we're talking about barriers that are put on an industry that are not legal in nature. There are, of course, legal constraints on journalism, such as libel, but in fact, because of freedom of the press and the Constitution, it's rather freeform in many ways. So most of the access to the marketplace is limited in journalism by the types of products to be sold that are highly controlled, and that's because of the business itself, not because of anything that's legal in nature. That's why we call it extra legal. The barriers put in place are not by law, but rather by business practice. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And PR and advertising is an integral part of journalism as a business. Advertising and PR really work as a constraint on journalism specifically, and we'll talk about that when we talk about what's called the propaganda theory. Okay, so you have to realize that journalism works as an industry, and as an industry, it's not seen as a way to generate income, but rather to service a community, and that's the way it always was traditionally when it started, and that's why it's so important. It's in the Constitution. The free flow of information was always necessary to make a democracy run effectively, and that's why it's so important. Is that's how you make your decisions about what you're going to do in life, who you're going to vote for, and how you want your country to be run, and who you are as an individual. So you need a free flow of information. It wasn't until the late 19th century that journalism was seen as some sort of lucrative enterprise, meaning that it could be something you could make money from. This was with the rise of yellow journalism in the penny press, where they started to realize that actually, if you used advertising, you could make a significant income from this. So, advertising and PR really emerge as part of this process where PR people start seeing journalists as a way to promote specific ideas for their entities and their businesses. And advertising, people are interested in who's reading newspapers and what type of news they're reading simply so that they can sell products to them. So journalism basically did not start as an industry, but it ends as one, and it continues to be one. Journalism then, therefore, news becomes a product, okay? And if you want to run a successful business, and this is just something you need to know for life, there needs to be a certain level of control over the product you produce, and you need to have some sort of predictable return on your investment. Therefore, the product needs to be standardized to some extent to guarantee a reliable sales base. So you want news to be standardized to sell to a specific audience. Okay? News has to become a product for sale to a specific demographic group and then needs to appeal to that group to sell. So what you do is you come up with some way of standardizing news so it can be sold to specific people. The New York Times sells to one demographic, the New York Post sells to another. Fox News sells to one demographic, MSNBC sells to another. So there's these things called news values. I'm going to put these all up at once. It's the way to ensure you have a marketable product that's going to get the right audience. And so what news values are basically elements that have to be present in each story for it to go to print that day. And as a reporter, you are, often, encouraged to come up with story ideas, but they aren't necessarily going to make it into the newspaper. Your editor tells you what's going to be news for the day. And the stories have to have these specific elements to make it into the news. Okay? It's got to have proximity. It's got to be something that's within your coverage area. It's got to be prominent. It's got to be about somebody important or some important issue. Key on the word important, like that in quotes, because important is different to all people. It's got to have some sort of impact. It's got to have an effect on people's lives. It's got to be timely. It's got to be happening right now. It's got to be distinctive. It's got to be something different. The old adage, dog bites man, that's news. Man bites dog, that's news. Okay? And then it's got to have convergence. It's got to allow for all different platforms to cover the story. You've got to have it on video for television. You've got to have it, you go out, send print reporters for in-depth reporting. And then you've got to, have all different aspects that can be covered by bloggers on the internet. Okay, so these are some of the news values that have to be covered by your story. You have to realize though that reporters really have very little control over their own stories and what stories make it in that day. This is because of the power structure of the newsroom. In order to maintain a secure return on your investment, you really have to realize that roles have to be really highly defined in news organizations. Okay, the content of news can change depending on who's in control of that content, but each role has a specific job and a specific power base. And what the publisher does is they're in charge of the entire news organization. Usually they're not there for the day-to-day, and usually they're not there for the specific stories itself unless it's something really important. Then there's the editor, and there's all different types of editors. There's the managing editor. We're just using newspapers as an example. The managing editor covers the entire newspaper. Then there are specific page editors, and that's for different beats, as we call it, or different sections. So there's the feature editor and the sports editor and the photo editor and so on and so forth. And like when I worked at the Southtown, I was working on the entertainment desk, and so I was under the feature editor, and therefore I was the reporter. And they would call me and say, I did mostly movie reviews. They would call me and say, these are the films you're going to review this week, and then they'd send me out, and I'd send my story back to my feature editor. They would, verify all the information, fix my terrible grammar, and the editors, you realize, get together every day and say, okay, this is how many columns sports is getting. This is how many columns features is getting, and so forth. And then they assign the stories, and then they come back and put the stories together. So the reporters go out and do the actual work in the sense of getting the stories and writing them, but the editors actually put it all together. And if it's a really important story, the publisher is going to get involved in how that story is being conducted as well. So content can change depending on what story it is and who's actually in control of it. There are two theorists named Chomsky and Herman, and they actually were trying to figure out how news gets slanted one way or another, and it didn't seem to make sense to them, because if any of you know reporters, most people who are reporters are really high-minded, objective people, and they're trying very, very hard. They have their own political beliefs, but they're trying very hard to get the news to the people that need to hear it. And so what they did is they looked at journalism as the business structure, and they realized that there were certain issues or concepts that were going to be systematically included or systematically excluded simply by the way journalism worked as a business, okay? So what they found was that due to the way news organizations are run, there's a bias built into the system. Okay, it's not about individual needs or beliefs, it's the way the system runs. And they realized that news had to go through what they called a series of filters before they were deemed worthy of coverage. A filter, if you think about like a coffee filter, as a story passes through these filters, it keeps all the bad stuff out, and then you get the end result. If it gets through all the filters, you get a lot of coverage, it'll be all positive. On the opposite end, if it does not pass through the filters, you're going to get a lot of negative coverage, or you're not going to get every coverage at all. Okay? You're going to get stopped. The specific filters they talk about, because we're in a hurry, we'll talk only about 4 of them briefly, is, for example, consolidation of ownership. If you have 7 entities that are in control of all news, basically, you're going to get stories that are slanted one way or another. Rupert Murdoch owns News Corp, which owns News of the World in London, well, former News of the World, and owns Fox News. When Rupert Murdoch was in trouble for News of the World reporters hacking into people's phones to get their messages, to get stories, the coverage of it on Fox News is very different than the coverage in like the New York Times. That's how consolidation of ownership slants a story. Advertising is vital. This is where it comes up. If you are going to write a story that's a negative depiction of an advertiser, it's not going to happen. That story's not going to run because they're the ones who are funding the news organization. PR in terms of sourcing, you're going to send out press releases. If the news organization writes a really negative piece, you're either not going to get information in the future, or there's going to be a lot of complaints. News needs sources versus need news. It's a really codependent relationship. So a lot of the newspaper really is just PR if you actually read it. And then flack is, are you going to insult the readers? Are they going to get angry? Are you going to get a lot of flack and negativity? If you make it through these 4 filters, and there's one more which we're not going to discuss, if you make it through these filters, you're going to get positive coverage, you're deemed worthy, and that's going to make news for the day. If you don't, it's going to be the opposite. Okay? There's another theorist named Daniel Hallen. And what Daniel Hallen tried to do was to look at how he saw coverage following public opinion, meaning that news as a product was trying to focus on what the public thought about it. And the assertion here is that news coverage follows the way people think, okay? He sees public opinion as being a series of spheres, and that issues travel through the spheres as the public changes their mind on that issue. Okay, so the coverage changes as the public changes because they're trying to sell it to a specific public, and he sees this as being there as being 3 different spheres of public opinion. The sphere of consensus, I'll put them all up. The sphere of consensus, where almost everyone in the status quo believes it, and if that's true, then you get positive coverage and you get a lot of it. Something like, we should fight terrorism. Terrorist acts are bad. Okay, that works really well. Everyone believes that. Legitimate controversy, on the other hand, is when there's equal weight in the status quo on each side, where it's balanced coverage, and you get a lot of it, but you get balance on both sides. Like the drones controversy, you're getting a lot of people on both sides of the aisle thinking this is good or thinking this is bad. So you're getting a lot of balanced coverage on that. Abortion was always in legitimate controversy. The pro-life people and the pro-choice people, there's kind of a balance there. Where abortion starts to fall into the sphere of deviance, which is something that the status quo rejects and only a small minority believes, is when people who go out and kill abortion doctors and blow up clinics. Okay, then you get no coverage or negative coverage. It's something that's within like the wild west of the public opinion. So your issue can move from sphere to sphere, and as it does, the coverage of it will change. And as I just mentioned with abortion, it's starting to move from sphere to sphere. If you look at the sphere of AIDS, it started off in the sphere of deviance, and then it's basically moved up to the sphere of consensus, where everyone is now there's not a lot of sympathy for people with AIDS. Okay, so this is how news gets biased or slanted or changed because of the business itself and how news is run and how advertising and PR actually have an impact on it. Okay, that's lecture number 3, and I'll see you next week.